So Leah Perot is an author, writer, and speaker from Saskatchewan. Her first book, published by Novalis in 2009, is entitled How Far Can We Go? A Catholic Guide to Sex and Dating. And since then, she's been reflecting and teaching on sexuality and relationships across the country. She's married to Mark and mom to, and I love all of these names, Robin, Elliot, Charlize, and Atticus. So please let's all give a warm and silent clap welcome to Leah.
Thank you so much. Well, it's wonderful to be with you. I'm speaking to you from Saskatoon this morning. I have recently moved to Swiftcurrent, but I'm visiting my parents, so we're enjoying that weekend, and this Zoom conference allows for a really fabulous way to see all of you. If I'm able to see some of your faces, that'd be great. Please interrupt me during the presentation if there are questions while we go. I'm happy to answer those from the chat or defer them till we get there, but don't feel like you have to wait until the end. So with us only having 53 minutes, I'll launch in. I'm going to do a brief overview of some definitions on how I understand the church's teaching on marriage and sexuality, and then introduce you to our dating chart, which if you've read the book that was mentioned in the intro, will not be unfamiliar, but hopefully is a good review and a good introduction for those who haven't seen it before. So I will try sharing the screen again. Nope, back here. Oh, and now it's been disabled. Renan, are you able to re-enable that for me? There it is. Okay. So way back as I was leaving high school and getting into university, a good friend of mine, Brett, and I got to university, and there was a big group of Christians, evangelical Christians from InterVarsity and Catholic Christians at Catholic Christian Outreach in Regina, and a few Eastern Catholics smattered in. It was our experience that for those of us committed to living out the church's teaching, while some of our friends were out having sex, we were getting together and talking about sex and relationships. Over time, as our friends started to be youth ministers and teachers, there was this inevitable desire for someone to come and talk to youth groups or young adults or people about sex and dating. And it was the least desired topic. And Brett and I were on that like a dirty shirt. We'll talk about that. And from those very first days, we started asking, what is the question that people are asking? And some 80% of the questions we would get before presentations would be some variation of how far can we go? We know what the church's teaching is on sex and marriage, right? That's not new. People mostly know that the church says, wait until you're married if you want to express sexuality in a healthy way. But what they don't know is how to navigate getting to marriage and what's okay physically when the church says save sex for marriage. And so we developed our framework, and 20 years later, it's still a framework we find helpful, that we still what I do today. So one of the big challenges that we found was that lots of people are struggling with a sense of positivity around sexuality and the church, right? Because when we ask people, what does the church say about sex? The overwhelming answer was no, like don't have it, don't do it, not good, right? And even though that's not the heart of the church's teaching, it's still very much a part of how the culture understands the church with regard to sex. And so we like to start by reminding people that God and the church want you to have a great sex life if you're called to express yourself sexually. And all of us are called to express ourselves sexually, whether it's in marriage and through sexual expression, or in the single life as human beings created male and female. And so sort of turning that assumption about the negativity of sex on its head is a really helpful place to start. I always start by reminding us that the context that we're working in within Catholicism broadly is that sexuality is understood as a function of marriage, right? That sexual expression is understood as a function of marriage. And so we have for years defined marriage as the gift, the full gift of one whole person in all their parts, spiritual, emotional, intellectual, social, and physical, to another whole person, and the mutual reception of that gift for as long as they both shall live. And so within this definition, we're understanding um, sexuality as an integrated component of whole people. And so we're sexual before we're married, right? We're created sexed, male and female. And uh, within the context of marriage, sex as an action is the fullest physical expression of a total gift of self. So we talk with young people, we talk about some of the other fullest expressions. When someone buys a house with another person, we might see that as the fullest social sign of the gift that they have to give to each other. And so when roommates move in, we understand that they aren't giving the same gift as two married people who build a home together, right? So who rent their first apartment or buy a home and then send out their address to the people that they love as a collective, right? So we have these fullest social gifts. Another sign of a social gift might be the merging of resources and bank accounts. When you're dating and engaged, you spend your own money the way that you would on your own. And when you get married, you start to ask, how are we going to spend our money, right? So we have these full gifts that we give to each other. Spiritually married people give to each other back and forth in ways that people who are not married to each other don't. And so we can see that there are this range and progression of gifts that we give. And sex belongs in marriage because it's this fullest physical expression of a total gift of self. And it has this potential to create little people who need you for the rest of forever. As a dimension of humanity, and I am drawing on Pope John Paul II for this, sex is to be created for in an embodied way, to be a gift of God, a gift of self to God and others. And so in this broad understanding, our tradition understands that to be created as a sexual being is to see oneself, one's body, one's spirit as fundamentally created for relationship with one another. And so we begin this giving of self from the moment of our conception, right? I want you to think about the babies you have waited for in your life. And some of you might be biological parents, and some of you aren't, obviously. But all of us have waited for babies. We've waited for siblings. We've waited for a neighbor to give birth down the road and look forward to meeting and holding that tiny new baby, a niece or a nephew, right? Our own children, if that's been part of God's plan for us. And so as soon as we hear about a baby coming, it usually brings great joy, sometimes some fear as well. But in time, we start to anticipate, who is this person growing in secret, right? And I always remember when we were pregnant with our first baby, right? And I started to feel the baby move. And my husband was waiting to be able to hear the baby move. And our first was a social butterfly from the time she was conceived. And as soon as she could move, she would move around when there were other voices in the room, like as if she were saying, let me out, I want to be a part of the party, right? And when Mark would talk to her, she would respond with movement. And our second was an introvert from the very beginning. He would move when it was still and quiet and no one was around, and get very quiet or sleepy and not move a lot when there was lots of noise, right? And so in this way, we started to see the gift that they were, the way they would interact with the world. And so we don't start self-giving when we get married and start to have sex if that's what we're called to. we begin living out the self-giving that is a part of our sexuality from the moment we exist, right? And this giving and receiving happens. And that's what sexuality is all about. Dating is getting to know one of God's children as a discernment of marriage with that person. And I think this is really critical because so much of our discourse about sexuality in the church particularly focuses on what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do, but actually dating and marriage is a profound act of continual discernment in faith. And so some dating resources over the last 30 years have really focused on how do you get to know, how do you make the decision that this is the person you want to marry? And really focused in on don't date people who couldn't be that person. But our philosophy has always been, well, you can't possibly get to know if this person is the right person without entering into some sort of discernment process, some sort of a special relationship, a relationship that is distinct from pure friendship. And so if we understand dating as a discernment process, we enter into it a little bit differently. And if we enter into it thinking that it has a for sure outcome, I'm going to marry the person that I date, or, I don't know if I'll marry them. We think you can't know. And so the only way to get to know is to enter into that discernment process. And we don't get hung up on whether we call it dating or courting or uh, other things. The most important thing is that it's a discernment, and it's an intentional discernment where we're asking God, is this the person? I often remind people that uh, when we enter into a dating relationship, that dating often involves dumping. It's going, if it doesn't result in finding the person that I'm called to spend my life with, it will result in my articulating that this is not the person. And so we enter into it knowing that there is risk here, assuming that at some point we may need to say this is not where the path is going. And we want to give of ourselves and receive the gifts of another person as faithfully and gently and kindly as we can, so that we're always reverencing this person we're discerning with. I also want to talk about healthy celibacy. Celibacy is a renunciation for now or forever of marital sexual intimacy, where we are expressing our sexuality through service and relationship with many members of a community. And so even though I am called to marriage and have been married for 16 years, I practice healthy celibacy with everybody else in my life. Right? This is not just a skill for people with single vocations. It's a skill for all of us. And if we don't have healthy celibacy, we won't have healthy sexual expression because it's an exercise of prudence and chastity. And we need those skills in marriage too, right? I often joke with teenagers who are very eager to figure out who they're going to marry so that they can have sex. I say, I spend more time in my marriage changing toilet paper rolls than I do having sex, right? There are a lot of celibate moments in my marriage, even with my partner, and learning how to express my sexuality and the gift of myself through service and relationship, in addition to sexual intimacy, is really an important skill. So I think it's important that we talk about that. I define chastity as giving and receiving the gifts of sexuality in light of God's call and timing, with profound respect for your own and others' boundaries. Some of you will know, if you followed my blog and my writing for the last several years, that my twin sister was murdered by her partner. And so domestic violence is a real passion for me to work at identifying those challenges. And as I talk with married people within the church and outside of it, I'm constantly shocked. Maybe I shouldn't be, but I am, at just how many people within the church and outside of it are not experiencing a chaste love. They're not experiencing a respectful love. They're not finding in their marriages and their relationships the kind of freedom and respect for boundaries that are essential to healthy relationships. And so chastity is a skill that is not just waiting for sex in marriage, but once we're having sex, should we be called to it? It's about, I have a gift to give for you. Are you ready to receive that gift? This is what it might look like for me. Does that feel safe and free and good for you? Or is it risky and not safe or not a good time? And so how do we practice the art of waiting on God's time and giving and receiving gifts when God is calling us to, but not forcing our gifts on people or uh, withholding gifts or capitalizing the gifts of sexuality, right? I'll give you intimacy when you behave the way I want you to, or um, you know, there's just a whole dynamic there that is violations of chastity, right within marriage. And so when we date well, which I'm going to talk about next, we learn slowly in time in the early stages of physical expression of intimacy with holding hands and hugs and kissing. We learn about how we can give and receive the gifts of sexuality chastely. And these are skill sets we need for healthy expression of sex in marriage, should we be called to it. And so this builds on the last definition where I talk about purity as living your life so that the language of your body is speaking the truth. Sometimes in discourse around dating and relationships in the church, people talk about purity as not touching each other, right? Like if we just don't touch each other, or we just don't kiss, or we don't express ourselves that way, then we can be sure that we're being pure. But in fact, kissing your grandmother when you go to visit her is not an impure action. Hugging a friend that you haven't seen for a long time is not an impure action. It might be an unwise action in the middle of a COVID outbreak, right? But it's not impure. And so, how do we hold on to an understanding of purity that really is about speaking honestly the language of the body, appropriately the language of the body, so that whenever I use the language of my body, I am speaking something that is true and something that honors God, right? So we've all watched movies where there's bets about whether or not you can get someone to date you, right? And this is a fundamentally dishonest way of engaging in human relationships, right? Because it doesn't treat the other person as a person, but an object to be used, a thing to be conquested, right? Instead of as a human being with their own dignity and a desire to enter into relationship. So purity is not the absence of touch. It's learning how to use touch in a way that glorifies God. I'll just also mention here that Pope John Paul II in the Theology of the Body was, as a Polish person, right, was deeply influenced, despite being a Roman Catholic, by Eastern Christianity. And he has a beautiful section in Theology of the Body where he talks about sexuality and divinization, right? That in and through our bodies, we are becoming like God. And because he's writing this anthropology, Theology of the Body is an anthropology, understanding what it means to be human, he sees our sexuality and our sexual expression of intimacy as profoundly linked to our divinization. And Eastern Catholics tend to be far less scandalized by that than Western ones, right? That it would actually be right in the middle of your sexuality and your sexual expression, that you could be becoming more like God and tasting who God is more explicitly in and through your sexuality. And so I'm really grateful to the Eastern Church for that gift, that is not so scandalous as it is in the West. All right, how do we understand dating then? What would relationships look like if we're doing this well? So I've already said that the hard line, the very clear teaching of the church, is that we save sex for marriage if we're called to it, right? And so we don't. It's not a surprise to any of you that our church says, wait until you're married. That's the best way to live, because it's a reflection of this full gift of self, and because marriage images the complete and total self-giving of the Trinity. Great. So that top line on this chart, and I think I might be able to write on it right here. Yeah, we'll use a pen. So this top line up here represents a fullness of closeness or intimacy, right? And so sex is above the line. And this line over here on this side represents a long time with a great deal, the most commitment, right? So the two people at the top we would call spouses, and the people down here over at the bottom of the chart are strangers. And dating is simply the discernment process that gets you from stranger to spouse. So if you look at the straight black line connecting those two corners, you have the fastest way between 2 points is a straight line. And we think that there's something decent about this straight line up here, this one that goes all the way up here like this, straighter than mine. And that is that it acknowledges that there is a relationship between intimacy and time and commitment. It makes sense. This is completely logical. Everyone you've ever met starts as a stranger, right? And over time, you spend time with them and become more committed to them. And then you grow in intimacy or closeness, right? So if a stranger runs up to you on the street crying and is like, "Can you please just give me a hug?" And what do? You run away. Like I might try to help you, right? Like it sounds like you need some help, but I'm likely not going to give you a hug and a cuddle, having never met you. I'm going to feel very awkward because we intuitively recognize the logic between time and commitment and intimacy. Someone you're best friends with who starts crying, you're probably going to be very physically connected to them. Like, can I give you a hug? You might put your arms around their shoulders. You might stop them from falling down. You will offer closeness and intimacy to someone who you have time and commitment with because it's safe to do so, right? And so you have a chart like this with everyone you know, except that only one, or maybe if you're widowed, you know, maybe two, over the course of a lifetime is not going to end in marriage. So at a certain point, instead of accelerating up towards marriage, the relationship curves off and it grows in depth at the same level, right? And grows deeper, but it doesn't progress to marriage and sexual expression. So we think that straight line is helpful. But we also know that human intimacy doesn't progress in a straight line, right? So when you were building friendships, right? I remember walking in at the first day of kindergarten and feeling like not super confident that I was going to be able to handle this. Then I saw across the room someone I'd met at preschool and they were playing in a sandbox. And I was like, oh, I could go and play at the sandbox. And on this scary day, we played at the sandbox and we held hands, and we discovered that we were going to be okay together. And all of a sudden, we were faster, closer friends than we were before the sandbox. Does that make sense? Right? These human interactions that we have over significant events increase the intimacy, not in a straight linear line, but actually in little jogs, right? So the math geeks in the room can see that the rate of increase goes faster after these points. So you'll see these little bent points down here in the line, and there's not just three, there are actually many. But so you start hanging out with people, and maybe over here somewhere you declare that you're dating, you have a defining the relationship talk, and instead of just being people who hang out from time to time and enjoy each other's company, you're like, you know what, we actually are going to discern whether or not this is a good fit for us for marriage, right? And when you declare yourselves dating and tell people that you're a thing, that increases your sense of intimacy. And maybe the first time you hold hands or kiss does the same thing. You get this little jog of intimacy. And it certainly happens when you get storm stayed somewhere and end up talking all night long. Or you have your first fight and make up. Or you get engaged, right? All of these little moments are going to increase that intimacy faster. And because you're going to have those little jogs, you want to slow it down at the beginning and let it increase faster as you approach marriage. This also helps in case at a certain point you transfer this chart from a dating chart to a friends chart or a not friends chart, right? because you haven't given more at these levels down here than you were called to give. And so you protect yourself and one another from giving more than you're called to give, so that if you're called to break up, you can break up more easily. And if you're called into a deeper relationship, you can grow in intimacy more rapidly as it becomes safer to do so. So then what are all these crazy lines in the middle? Well, I said that whole people are emotional, social, spiritual, intellectual, and physical. And when people ask, how far can we go? What can we give? Right? We know we're not supposed to be having sex, but what can we do? Um, one of the best ways to figure that out is to make that discernment relative to the other gifts that you're giving, which your hormones are not driving as hard as the physical gifts, right? Your hormones don't tell you, maybe we should pray together. Usually your hormones are not concerned about whether or not you're praying together, right? They're not asking, driving you to like, have you told this person what you learned in class today, right? Your hormones don't care what you learned, right? They're concerned, they are designed to further the human race and be interested in getting you pregnant. And so, because they're designed that way, the physical gifts can be really hard because your body sort of takes over in a way that it doesn't with the emotional, social, spiritual, and intellectual gifts. So if you're on a first date and someone wants you to, it like asks you to tell them your deepest secret, you're probably going to feel pretty uncomfortable with that, right? It would not be wise to tell your deepest secret to someone on a first date. And your brain knows that. Your body is going to guard that deepest secret. And so on a first date, you might tell the kinds of things you'd put in a resume or post on your social media wall as the about me information, right? Where do I come from? Who are my favorite people? What's my favorite food? All those sort of cursory surface level things. And you start to see if you have any connections. And so, should I be touching the genitals of someone who doesn't know my deepest secret? Probably not. Right? And so I can use that intellectual comparison to say, is this an appropriate gift for the level of commitment and time that I have to this person, allowing myself to move? So if I keep all of those levels of intimacy roughly in the same place as we progress in intimacy and towards the discernment of marriage, then I can regulate the gifts I give physically over the course of my relationship. Now, when I talk about this, one of the things that I find so fascinating is if I asked each of you to plot out the order of physical signs of intimacy on this graph and where you thought they were appropriate, you'd all have different charts. Some of you would say, I don't want to kiss until I'm engaged to someone. Some of you might say, I don't even want to kiss someone until I'm married. Some people would say, I would kiss on a first date for sure. Right? And other people would be like, there are a lot of kinds of kissing. Right? What kind of kissing are we talking about? And so one of the skills, when I talked about chastity, living chastity when you're dating being a great skill for marriage, right? Just because people are married does not mean that they're ready to have sex at any moment of their marriage all the time, or that it would be appropriate to do so. So part of how we learn how to navigate one another's boundaries is by talking about the kinds of physical gifts where we feel called to give and what other gifts go with them as we go, right? So I would not suggest that you say, we are never going to do, except for sex, we are never going to kiss with our mouths open before we're married. You know what? How about we decide whether or not we're called to do that when it seems like God is asking that, right? Or we feel like that might be a gift we want to give. I would recommend that people set soft lines. And so if you set the line here and you say, look, what we feel ready for right now physically is holding hands. What other gifts, emotionally, socially, spiritually, and intellectually, go with holding hands? You know, would you hold hands with someone who hadn't met your parents? Most people would. Except if you're under 15, right? If you're under 15 and you're holding hands with somebody and they don't know your family, that might be a bit odd. For most people, it would be, right? And so we are right now we're holding hands, and we're going to talk about what other sorts of gifts we give that are appropriate to that. And then when we start to want to do more, when our bodies start to say, I'd like to do more than that, we ask, are we giving gifts emotionally, socially, spiritually, and intellectually that line up with holding hands, right? Um, and in my book, which you can still get from Paulus Press in the States, or send me an email because it's out of print in Canada, I have lists of gifts emotionally, socially, spiritually, and intellectually that can allow you to talk about what kind of gifts would you give, right? If you're in high school, would you wear the bunny hug, or sorry, Saskatchewanese for hoodie? Would you wear the sweater of someone that you're dating who thinks your religion is stupid and dismisses you when you talk about growing in faith, right? How did these gifts line up with each other? And the art of relationships and sexual expression is being able to give and receive gifts that you both feel really comfortable with. So when you date this way and you say, you know what, we're not going to kiss until we're confident that we do respect each other's faith, that we can share what's happened in our day. Maybe we aren't sharing our deepest secrets yet with someone that we're having light kisses with on the lips or the cheeks, but not with open mouths, right? Maybe we want them to have met our friends and feel comfortable with our friends. We want to enjoy a shared hobby together and have things to talk about and do that feel good, that are not physically intimate. We want to make sure that those things are great things to do. We learn how to talk about physical intimacy. And I cannot even tell you how many married people I know in the church and outside of it who are like, we have sex, but we never talk about it. And then I talk to one or both partners and they're like, yeah, I really don't like what they do with this. Or I feel like my partner doesn't communicate what they want sexually in an effective way. And I'm always disappointing them. Right. And I'm like, if you had dated well, you would have been talking about, what does holding hands mean to us? What does kissing mean to us? Why do I want this? What am I trying to say with the language of my body? Because when I can say to someone that I'm dating, when I kiss you, it means there is no one in the world I would rather be with than you right now. Or when we lie down and cuddle on the couch, what I'm saying is, I feel so safe with you. I never have to worry that you're not going to take care of me, right? But when you get to marriage and you've used sex to feel close to each other, but you don't know how to talk about it, as soon as there are challenges in your relationship, your sexuality becomes a really complicated place where there are big dramas going on, and married couples are having a lot of trouble and they don't have the communication skills. So dating this way, asking, what do these gifts mean to us? Today, I'm not feeling comfortable with this. Another day, I might feel more comfortable, right? And when we're married, sometimes what felt good and right yesterday doesn't feel good and right today. And sometimes that's because of an injury, or uh, partner has a disability that emerges over time, or a mental health challenge, and they can't give what they could give last week, right? And so we learn by dating this way how to respect one another's boundaries and how to speak the language of our bodies honestly, truthfully, faithfully, and most importantly, in a way that makes us more like God, right? We become more like the Christ, the incarnate Christ, who gave himself fully, even in the body, up to death, so that we could all have eternal life. That's the connection, right? The whole goal of all of our vocations is that we would become more like Christ, more capable of giving the kinds of gifts that God gives, so that we can spread love in the world. All right, I'm going to move on from here. I want to leave time for questions. Oh, clear the annotation. I just have 2 quick slides, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments. Um, Clear that X off there. So one of the things I always make sure to mention is that some of us have made mistakes already, and we feel like we're broken, or we've given away too much and we'll never be okay. And this is just simply not true. This car, this beautiful car, for those of you who are involved in and invested in vehicles, is a write-off. Like, there is nothing that the best mechanic in the world can do to fix this car. They will use it for parts for other, I don't know, Ferraris, whatever it is, right? But we are not cars. God never writes us off. There is absolutely no damage that we could do to ourselves or have done to us that God does not desire and offer to heal in us. It might take time. It might take years. It might take a ton of work, counseling, and spiritual direction, and lots of trips to reconciliation. But there is nothing, nothing, nothing that you could do or have done to you sexually that God does not desire to heal. And so sometimes we give too much too fast. When Mark and I were dating, we gave too much physically. And early in our relationship, maybe 6 months in, I felt like we didn't have sex, but I felt lonely. Like, we would get together and we would make out and we would be touching each other, but I felt like he didn't know who I was inside. And I didn't feel safe to tell him things that had happened in my day. And we had to pull it back down, which it turns out is a lot harder than doing it right the first time. But that's how we learn. And if you haven't already made mistakes here, I promise you that you will do things and give things, and then wonder after if that was the right decision. And the secret to that, the way forward from that, is not never touch each other, be afraid of making mistakes. The secret to dealing with that is to let God heal you, to recognize, let God show you when you give too much, especially when it's a little bit too much instead of all the way too much, and let him correct you and learn to go back and to say to the person that you're discerning with, I think I gave too much and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to pull our soft line back down here, whether it's emotional or social or spiritual or intellectual. One of the things that people tell me with online dating, which was not a thing when I was dating back in the 90s, or at least not a thing that people thought was acceptable nearly to the extent it is now, is that you can get way, way, way emotionally and socially connected before you even meet. So you're texting on an online app, right? And you feel, by the time you meet in person, because you might be across the country or in different countries, by the time you meet, you feel super, super close. But physically, you have had no steps. So if you rush right up to, lying down together and cuddling and touching each other, and deep kissing, it can feel like a very deep violation. So you might have known each other for 6 months and been super invested, and you might even be on the brink of getting engaged. But actually, your body needs some time to start gradually working towards physical intimacy so that you don't skip steps. Does that make sense? All right. The last slide for me, and then some questions and comments from you. First, G.K. Chesterton wrote that chastity does not mean abstaining from sexual wrong. It means something on fire, like Joan of Arc. It means being so intimately connected to and in touch with your body, and in touch with God's call for your body, that you are able to learn and to grow in recognizing how your body expresses all of the mystery, complexity, and love that your soul has to give in this united body spirit that we are as human beings, right? And we know that this body spirit that we are is an expression of who God is for the world. That's not boring. That's not repressive. It's like when you walk into the grocery store and you know that every moment of your life, it has sacramental capacity. You don't be rude to the grocery clerk who's serving you, because this is a sacramental moment, right? And so is holding hands, and so is dating, and so is marriage if you're called to it. So every moment of my life, living chastity is this exciting space where I can be an expression of God's love for the world. And Dorothy Day said that we've all known this long loneliness, right? The shadow side of our sexuality, which is meant to call us into self-giving and receiving the gifts of others and relationship. The shadow side of that sexual longing is that ache when you lie alone at night and you wonder if your friend really understood what you said when you said you were hurting, right? Or you're married and you're lying beside your spouse after an argument and you say, like, I don't know, did I marry the right person? Are they ever going to understand me? Why do we keep missing each other here, right? Or your best friend and you have a misunderstanding and you wonder if anyone's really going to truly get you. We all have these moments of our lives of knowing this long loneliness, which is the solitude of being created in one body for relationship eternally, right? We're created for this eternal consummation of love in community. And Dorothy Day reminds us that that long loneliness is meant to drive us into relationships with one another. And so we're invited to take the risk of being known because communion is what we're called to. Okay, I'm going to stop talking and I would love to hear what you're thinking, any questions or comments that you have.